He's on mute, of course. So. Let's see.
I'm going to check with Laura and see if the recording's going on.
Okay.
Can you hear me? Okay.
All right. Okay. It looks like, from what I can gather, it is recording. I just want to let people know we are recording this session, and so if you are not on mute, unless you're asking a question or something like that, if you could put yourself on mute, that would be great, because since we're recording it, we don't want dogs and children and those kinds of noises. Although we love them, we just don't want them on the tape. Thank you. Okay, so before I jump in and get started, let me see if I can advance my slide. I want to talk about a model called the window of tolerance. Now, the window of tolerance is really useful in thinking about how we manage our emotional states. So normally, the window of tolerance, we're in the optimal arousal zone, where it's smooth sailing, things are okay, we're fine. Except sometimes when we get triggered by something emotional, or we get introduced to new material that is maybe challenging, we can go into either hyper or hypoarousal. Hyperarousal is when you're emotionally overwhelmed, you might feel panicked or unsafe. And hypoarousal is numbness, or no feelings and no energy. And we present this because this, material around social justice and racial equity can be charged, and we want people to be able to be mindful of where they are in this window of tolerance. So with that, we'll just move on to our next slide, which is a little bit of a personal reflection on why we do racial equity and social justice work in suicide prevention personally. So for me, as an Asian American who's an attempt survivor with lived experience with PTSD and depression, I have never experienced what it's like to have my cultural background acknowledged, never mind addressed in mental health field, until my current therapist asked me a few years ago how being Japanese American affected my experience. Now, I'm not young. So before that, and I had been in the system for a long time, no one had ever asked. So in addition, working in suicide prevention as an attempt survivor and an impacted family member, I rarely have ever seen myself reflected in the suicide prevention materials and efforts presented. Now, I grew up in the 70s in a primarily white community where I was acutely aware that I was not white. Also in my family has an impressive legacy, as my Japanese American father was incarcerated in an American concentration camp during World War II. So I grew up with this visceral understanding of racial oppression. And I was also a baby feminist in the 70s, where I learned to question gender inequities and understand oppression in general. And in much of my professional life as an educator, I have developed and enacted anti-racist curricula. So using a racial equity and social justice lens as a mental health activist feels natural and is my world perspective. It's also important to me professionally and personally to make space for people of color like myself to have a voice. Because if there isn't an explicit commitment to inclusion, then our voices get left out. So working on racial equity and social justice and suicide prevention allows me to be my whole self and bring to the table perspectives that I might not have been able to had the coalition not made this commitment to racial equity and social justice. This allows for more diverse perspectives, not only mine, but others as well, which benefits all of us.
So for me, as a woman, I can probably very easily tell you how my identity and my story have been shaped by my gender. But as a white woman, and even as a white woman who thinks about social justice, racial equity, and white privilege every day, and I've been doing that for many years, I can honestly say that I still really struggle to define what exactly whiteness is and explain how my whiteness has shaped me. I think as white people, we're only taught how racism impacts people of color. We aren't taught the flip side to that. We're not taught how we as white people directly benefit from this oppression and from systemic racism. And even after I came to understand that all white people, including me, benefit from these inequities, because systemic oppression perpetuates itself in part by keeping privilege invisible, it was still a slow process to understand all of the ways in which I benefit. And in fact, I'm still uncovering blind spots about manifestations of privilege that I experience as a white person all the time. It wasn't until college and even after I graduated that I started to learn what it really meant to leverage privilege and power as a white ally and how to do that. And even still, it was somewhat of an abstract understanding. I knew that as a white person, I had an obligation to speak up about issues of racism because I was in a position of privilege and power to do so. And while I gradually started getting better at it in some situations, I was still unclear on the best way to do it in a lot of other cases. And I was still sheltered from a lot of the systemic ways in which my professional context had been shaped by racial inequity. Or maybe more importantly, how I could leverage my power as an ally in that context. And that understanding is one I've only been developing over time. As a recent example, we've been talking at the MCSP about issues of race and equity for years, but it was without much forward momentum. And it wasn't until Pata came on board the EC and we began talking about enacting a plan that I began to understand how it might be possible to do this work in an organizational or structural context. We knew all along that we had to change, but until Pata joined the EC and brought her expertise to the work, we struggled with understanding exactly what needed to change or how to make those changes. And we're still working to figure that out. And it turns out that that's a really big part of the work. We've made a lot of progress, but we're still working and we're still trying to integrate social justice and racial equity into all levels of our organization and to move towards being a truly equitable coalition. So as a white woman, part of my story is how I hold myself accountable. It's how I examine and counter, even if it's imperfectly, the messages we're all inundated with. And part of my story is how I work to uncover my own blind spots in all of this. And I still struggle to understand what whiteness is. Except I know that it's a system of privileges and power that I benefit from and have a responsibility to dismantle. Except I know it's a set of norms we all take for granted that I have a responsibility to question and transform. Except I know that it has shaped me, even if I can't describe exactly how. Except I know it's the reason I need to prioritize this work, because unless we hold ourselves as white people accountable, and our organizations and communities as well, nothing will change.
Oh, oops. So just a little background about the Alliance for Equity. When I joined the executive committee of the MCSP 3 years ago, I asked Jen how many people of color were on it. And she looked at me a little sheepishly and said, "You're replacing the only one." So I thought that there needed to be more support for issues of people of color, as well as selfishly for myself. And so I suggested that we create a People of Color caucus. And then practically as it came out of my mouth, I thought we need a white ally caucus too, that people of color shouldn't be doing this work on their own. So I suggested we create the White Ally Caucus and that Jen should be the chair. Now you have to realize that Jen had just vowed to not chair any other committees. But to my relief, she said yes to this one. So we took this idea to the executive committee, which approved the creation of the two caucuses. And we later created the umbrella title of MCSP Alliance for Equity, which includes both caucuses. And mostly we work together, but we also do work in affinity groups at times. Because there are times when, for instance, the people of color want to talk about a particular issue just with other people of color or white people as well. And the kinds of things we've been doing are we reviewed the state strategic plan for equity issues. We brought equity issues and exercises to the executive committee and the general membership. We developed this toolkit, Widening Lens Toolkit, and we're working on a supplement about doing suicide prevention as a person of color in communities of color with the People of Color Caucus. And the focus of our next toolkit is gender.
So all of this meant that social justice and racial equity work had to inform all levels of our organization and all of our organizational priorities. The work itself had to be made a priority, but it couldn't stand alone. It had to be a part of everything we did. And it also meant that if we wanted to move towards equity, we were going to have some really difficult conversations. We were going to have to examine our existing organizational structure to identify what changes needed to be made. And then we were going to actually have to make those changes. Changes, by the way, that would be probably really challenging and often uncomfortable. And it meant we were going to encounter resistance, some of which we anticipated and some of which we didn't. And we'll talk about that a little later. But most importantly, it meant that if we put in the work, if we were willing to be uncomfortable and imperfect, if we were willing to learn from our mistakes and question things that we'd never even thought to question before, that we would begin to see change. And we have been slowly seeing a transformation within our coalition. We do have a long way to go, and the amount of progress we still have to make can be really daunting at times. But we've been really impressed by the commitment of our coalition members and how far we've been able to come in just a few years. The most significant change, I think, is that this work isn't just located in 2 people within our leadership anymore and within the Alliance, but rather almost all of our EC members and most of our general membership have begun to shift the way they think about our agenda and our work, and have brought questions of social justice and racial equity unprompted into our conversations. I've seen EC and general membership members bring social justice and racial equity into suicide prevention work outside of the coalition. And even though we have a way to go, I've seen people shift from asking, why do this work, to how can we do this work, to what's the next piece of this work. And that's been really rewarding.
So why do this work is a question we get all the time. So why are social justice and racial equity important to suicide prevention and mental health? Why use a racial equity and social justice lens to do suicide prevention when a majority of people who die from suicide are white men? We get this question all the time. And the first answer is that suicide affects everyone. Suicide is a public health issue that doesn't discriminate, and any death by suicide is a tragedy. In addition, systems of oppression intersect with suicide and suicide prevention in a number of ways. Racism hurts people of color and white people too, albeit differently. Racism increases the risk of mental health concerns and suicide for people of color. Racism systematically disenfranchises, erases, and constrains people of color, which results in poor physical and mental health outcomes. And racism gives white people unfair and unearned advantage, and the expectation of that advantage and privilege, and the belief that the advantage is deserved and is the norm. It also limits white people's perspectives and behaviors. So if we elevate the situation of those who are most marginalized, then we may catch others who are falling through the cracks. For instance, if we figure out how to provide transportation for people for appointments, there may be other people who needed that service who are probably falling through the cracks. Or if we have practitioners who practice cultural humility in their practice, then their ability to be non-judgmental and curious aids not only people of color, but others as well. Anti-racist work is suicide prevention. From a social determinants of health perspective, we must look at racism as a factor for suicide.
So another question that often remains unspoken, but still is largely on people's minds, especially when starting out, is why do white people need to do this work? Both personally and professionally, as white people and as allies, we have a responsibility not only to dismantle systems of oppression we unjustly benefit from, as well as systems that protect us while harming others, but also to follow the leadership of people of color with respect to our goals around racial equity within our organizations. And that's both in terms of what that equity might look like, and also what changes need to happen to truly reach that kind of equity. Because we are the ones who benefit, because we are the ones who knowingly or unknowingly uphold systemic racism and the institutional norms that perpetuate oppression against people of color, because we have more power and leverage, we can't ignore our role in this work. We also can't ignore our responsibility to people of color to follow their leadership as we move forward. As allies, we can speak to the resistance of other white people at the table because as white people, we ourselves have been and still are confronting our own resistance and blind spots. So we understand what that's like. And because of systemic racism, the unfortunate reality is that especially in predominantly white organizations, white people not only systemically but institutionally have more power. And therefore, as allies, we can and need to leverage that power to engage everyone in our organizations around issues of racial equity and social justice. And as white people, we can also do that with minimal risk. So how we could best involve white allies in all aspects of this work was a part of the conversation from the very beginning. When we started, the reason we created the Alliance for Equity with both a People of Color caucus and a White Ally caucus was that this work can't and shouldn't be done only by people of color, as Pat has said. We agreed from the outset that both of these groups were necessary pieces of a whole, that we would work collaboratively, but that we all had to do the work. Part of our work as white allies is owning our responsibility to be actively engaged in anti-racist efforts. As white people who unjustly benefit from racism, it isn't just our responsibility, but it's also our moral obligation to examine, question, and restructure these inequitable systems where we can. And it's also our responsibility and moral obligation in doing so to always, always align our efforts with the leadership, goals, and strategies of the individuals and communities of color we are doing this work with.
So doing this work as a person of color in a white context has specific concerns. If you're in a primarily white context and you are the only person of color, then there are things that you need to think about. For one, you need to take care of yourself because the burnout is real. Doing racial equity and social justice work as a person of color in white communities can be tough and exhausting, and sometimes this work can be traumatic. So it's really important to recharge and combat the trauma of racism related to the work in suicide prevention, as well as to the unrelated trauma of the racism we face every day. You need to find other people of color colleagues and safe spaces to nurture people of color, because finding people of color in suicide prevention that have similar experiences can be really helpful to validate one's own experience. They also can be sounding boards for approaches and strategies for doing this work, and that's why the Alliance for me has been so important. And identify your white allies. White allies are important in this work, and people of color shouldn't have to do all the labor, emotional or otherwise, as Jen mentioned. It's also important to identify specific allies that can help you with specific concerns and to whom you can refer questions from other white people. It's not your job as a person of color to educate all white folks who might have questions about racial equity and social justice. And you do not have to and cannot speak for all, whatever the group is. I don't know how many times I've been in a room as the only person of color and am expected to speak for all people of color. Not only am I not an expert in other people of color's experiences, but I'm also not even an expert in other mixed heritage Japanese Americans' experiences. When we allow white folks to assume that we can speak in sweeping generalizations about people of color, we erase ours and others' unique experiences. This is not to say there aren't common experiences that many people of color face when it comes to racism, but we need to go beyond this narrative to a more nuanced one. And even if there are common experiences, so I shouldn't have to, or you shouldn't have to speak for the entire group. And you can insist that white folks educate themselves and take responsibility for their own piece of the work. Oftentimes, white folks will ask you questions about racism and your experiences. And although you may choose to answer these inquiries, you're not responsible for educating them. There's ample literature, podcast videos that explore and explain systemic oppression and racism. You do not have to do the emotional labor of explaining racism, white privilege, or white guilt. However, it's a little different if you're in a leadership role in your organization. You do have a responsibility to find the balance between your obligation to engage with your organization around issues of social justice and racial equity through sharing your expertise and knowledge, and setting boundaries around what you can and cannot do. You do not have to defend your existence as a person of color or your experience. Sometimes people will attack people of color, especially those of us who point out racism in its individual cultural institutional manifestations. In my experience, these conversations are not always helpful to me or the white person, and it's okay to protect yourself, including walking out of a conversation if it feels harmful. And realize that change takes time, and it's not your sole responsibility to make that change. The work cannot be done only by a handful of people. There needs to be buy-in from the larger group, including the leadership, in order to move forward.
So after people ask us why do this work, a lot of people understandably then want to know, okay, well, how do we do this work? And I really wish I had a checklist for you. I really wish it was just as easy as having that checklist of tasks complete. But the real deep work of anti-racism is nuanced, ongoing, and fluid. So while I can't give you a checklist, I can share with you some of the things that people don't always see as being part of the work, but that are actually really fundamental to the work. Doing the work is making a commitment to make space for and follow through with the processes that make the most sense for your community or organization. And identifying what that process is together for your group is also part of the work. Doing the work is educating ourselves. but also taking action. Doing the work is gaining knowledge of and exploring foundational concepts. Doing the work is allowing ourselves to be uncomfortable, sitting with our own discomfort, and unpacking the reasons behind it. Usually discomfort with a particular issue or topic comes from the fact that we as white people have been sheltered from the full reality of what we're looking at. Not looking away is also part of the work. Doing the work is understanding and creating a process, and it's a process of becoming familiar with and owning our own shortcomings and where we need to do better, as well as setting goals around these gaps. It's follow through and action and changing behaviors, as well as as well as interrogating existing systems and norms within your organization. And while there isn't a checklist, part of the work is identifying the next steps that make the most sense for your group and your organization. Doing this work is holding ourselves accountable. And that means setting goals, but also thinking about a timeline. And when that timeline has lapsed, coming back to those goals and asking, has that goal been met, or has that goal begun to be met? If not, how do we reassess either that goal? So do we need an intermediary goal maybe? The timeline, do we just need to give ourselves more time to accomplish it? Or our own organizational readiness? Is this something we need to come back to later? And if that's the case, it's important to still include it in your revised accountability plan and come back. Accountability also means recognizing and building on our progress and our successes. Where are you going above and beyond what you'd set out to do? And how can you work towards those areas of strength? How can you build on that? And finally, as part of all of these pieces and in response to our ongoing assessment and accountability, this work requires that we make adjustments and that we're flexible. It's equally important to realize that something isn't working as it is to realize that something has worked. Both pieces of information can inform our next steps and how to move forward.
Okay, so the next thing we're going to be talking about is allyship. And we don't have time to explore all aspects of allyship, and we probably don't even know all aspects of allyship. We will be addressing this further in our next webinar. But we're going to start off with a scenario. I'm going to share a scenario with you, and I'd like you to put your responses in the chat box of what you would do in this scenario. So you're at a meeting, a board meeting, and you know, the conversation is going on, you have an agenda, you're working through the agenda, and a person of color brings up an equity issue that's off the agenda. And the white chair of the meeting dismisses the comment and says it's off topic and not on the agenda. And the person of color is silent. What would you do and why? Could some people put some stuff in the chat and help me out here? Let's see. What would you do and why? Okay, we have ask, create time at the end of the meeting or schedule another meeting to discuss. Also, if we could add it to the agenda, I would speak up and ask them to have them to listen, push it for the to be added to the agenda. Okay. Let's see. I would speak up and that we should add it to the agenda in the meeting. I think if we can't facilitate time now, we should at least discuss and allocate time later. Great. State that it sounds like an important topic and ask that we discuss it further. These are all really great suggestions, and I see some more coming in. That's great. And I think, you know, obviously it depends on who the person of color is too, how they would react. And I do see a lot of comments that talk about, you know, being an ally and kind of uplifting the conversation or making sure it's attended to. So if it were me, just personally in that situation, I would first want to point out, well, the first thing I want to point out before I react to it is that having a meeting agenda in the first place and following it without question is in of itself a cultured thing. It's a European norm. And although a Eurocentric norm. And although this is true, I'm not saying we should throw out all norms and all agendas. That's not what I'm saying. But they do need to be exposed and examined and questioned. Like, you know, are we committed to having an agenda and following it lockstep in terms of the time? Or are we flexible and can change that agenda? what is the norm in our organization? So it's important to think about these things that are considered just the normal way of doing things, but also have, you know, are cultured in and of themselves. So in this case, I probably would have felt silence. And depending on the context, I probably wouldn't have challenged the chair. And it would have helped me, like, you know, a lot of you would have done, if someone spoke up and validated the importance of the issue and questioned its dismissal, and perhaps giving me the floor to share the rationale for my agenda item, or, you know, we could come to some agreement about where to put it on this agenda, or if we needed another agenda, but just to elevate the fact that I had a concern. But I would not have wanted someone to either speak over me, because sometimes people, you know, try to be an ally and they really speak over, and Jen's going to talk to that, or put me on the spot. Like, what did you say and why were you saying it? And, like, you know, all this kind of stuff. Giving someone some space and opportunity to define what they want to share is I think what would have helped me. So, okay.
So that scenario, I think, is a really great example of the importance of being an ally and the impacts that it can have, right? If we as allies elevate the voices and concerns of people of color without speaking over, that can really make a difference. But it is a really complicated and nuanced process to learn how to become an ally. It's a continual process. We're always learning. But as white people, allyship is one of the most important pieces of social justice and racial equity work. As Pat has stated, there's a lot more to allyship than we have time to present. I encourage you to look back in the toolkit for more information. Our next webinar is actually going to be on whiteness, and we'll talk more about allyship then. There's actually even debate about the word itself, the word ally. A lot of people prefer the word accomplice in the social justice community because it implies action and greater risk. I personally dislike the word accomplice because of the connotations with crime, but I do agree that being an ally is not passive. Action, and that means continual, informed, collaborative, and always connected with the goals and needs of communities and people of color, is constantly required if we're going to be true allies, rather than just pay lip service to allyship. Also, as allies, we have to take personal and professional risks in voicing our opinions, in elevating the voices of people of color, and in advocating for organizational commitment to this work, including the necessary structural changes that will actually move our organizations towards equity. We have to be willing to encounter and face resistance head on, even if it means we're seen as strident or difficult, and even if we face personal or professional backlash for doing so. So one of the things Pata alluded to is this idea of stepping up but not over. And as allies, we need to commit to being upstanders rather than bystanders. And that means really we need to be ready to challenge racist remarks or behavior. And that not only includes overtly racist remarks and comments, behaviors, but also more subtle microaggressions, but also, as Pata was mentioning, even behavior or statements that uphold systemic racism. And we need to be able to do that in both our personal and professional lives. But it's just as, if not more important than in becoming upstanders, we don't take away the agency of the people of color in the room to address the situation directly as they want to. So it's a really fine line between stepping up and stepping over. And one way I learned to deal with this balance is first by making it clear to the people of color I work with closest with that when it comes to these issues of racial justice and equity, they can always interrupt me and I will make space, I will stop talking, and I will make space for what they have to say. Another strategy that I've been practicing is I prepare myself to speak, but I pause for long enough that the people of color at the table can choose to address the comment or behavior first if they want to. And it's particularly important for me to take this moment to pause because not only am I white, but I'm also the managing director of my organization. And I need to be mindful that I do hold institutional power in that role. So while there isn't a prescribed formula and it's different for every organization, group, situation, and person, it is important to find a balance between allowing space and leaving too long a gap so that either the situation wouldn't get addressed before the conversation moves on, or the people of color in the room feel that there's an expectation that they speak up even if they're uncomfortable doing so because they don't know if anyone else will if they don't. Because so much of allyship is nuanced, communication is absolutely essential. And that means respectful, direct, and open communication with people of color has to be ongoing. However, as allies, we also need to respect the emotional labor that it can take for people of color to engage in some of these discussions. And we need to be clear that we are willing to have these conversations on their terms when they're ready, not on our terms. And as part of communicating through this process, it's really important that we're willing to not only receive feedback about our own behavior, but also examine ourselves and our actions and our statements in response to the feedback we receive. And it's really important that the people of color we're working with are aware that we're willing to do that. The most important thing when we're receiving feedback is to listen and to accept the reality that the person of color is presenting us with. When we get defensive or we express it wasn't our intent to harm, we inadvertently undermine not only the impact our words or actions have had, but also the very real pain of the person of color who is articulating to us what that impact was. We're also effectively gaslighting them by denying their ability to tell their own narrative and have ownership of their own experiences. Instead, we need to listen, accept that we have hurt this person and how we have hurt this person, and figure out how we can do better. And as part of this process, it's important to know who you can turn to when you're uncertain about a particular topic or situation. What people of color do you have strong relationships with? What people of color do you work most closely with? What people of color do you know who do this as part of their work? Is there a specific reason why this person you're thinking of is the right person to turn to? Or are you thinking of asking someone simply because they're not white? It's really important to never assume that people of color ever owe us feedback, period. But it's also especially presumptuous to make that assumption if we don't have a personal relationship with them and if they don't even do this as part of their work. But it's also important for us to understand as allies that even if we have a close relationship with the person in question, even if the person does this as part of their work, they still don't owe us feedback. It still needs to be up to them whether or not they have the emotional bandwidth to provide feedback at any given moment or for any given situation. And so for this reason, it's really important to ask if someone has the bandwidth before requesting feedback. I always try to do this even with Pata, who has told me many times that I can come to her always, and she'll let me know if it's a bad time. But by asking first, we respect the limits of the other person, and we don't pressure them to respond if they're not able to. If there isn't anyone you know that you can turn to, you can start online. There are a lot of great articles and resources that can answer common questions white allies have. I would encourage you to look especially for resources and articles written by people of color. And hopefully too, you can find some answers in the toolkit. There's a website, racejustice.org, which is a great resource. And you can also join the Alliance for Equity because we have these conversations regularly. And it's a great forum to deepen both theoretical and practical understanding of social justice and racial equity. It's really important to try and find ways to ask questions and address possible issues, not only as they come up, but also before they do. Being responsive to a particular issue shows that you're invested in making sure people of color feel heard and safe within your group. But proactive conversations with people of color about how they would prefer you to behave as an ally shows that you're willing to take action in a way that is in line with what feels safe and respectful to them, and that you want actual, not performative change. Another really significant part of being an ally and communicating as an ally is speaking with other white people. As allies, we're able to take greater risks in pointing out systemic injustice, and that means we have an obligation to do so. We can speak up about racism without fear of the same repercussions or backlash people of color face when they do so. For us, it's uncomfortable, but for people of color, the stakes are much higher.
So we're going to ask participants again to do some typing. One of the things that comes up when we start talking about how to do this work is barriers and resistance. And so what are some types of resistance to racial equity and social justice work that you've seen, experienced, or are aware of? And what might be some barriers to doing this work in your own organization? Or maybe you're doing it and you've come across some. So just take a minute, and if you would, put a few things in the chat, because it helps us kind of get a sense of where you all are at and what kinds of experiences you've had. So again, what are some types of resistance to racial equity and social justice work you've experienced, or that you've heard of, or comment that you know of? And what might be barriers to doing this work in your organization? So we don't have time to focus on this. Yes. Not enough Spanish speakers or co-workers, not having denial of responsibility and selfishness. There are very few mental health providers who who are Latinx or speak Spanish statewide. Some people do not see this work as a priority. Not understanding our role in racial equity work. Stigmatized views that lead to complete denial and refusal to acknowledge valid concerns. Minimalization, yes, yes. Fear might say the wrong thing, yes, yes. The lack of education and awareness, ignorance, more focus on outward appearance of the work rather than working with issues with the organizational structure. Antiquated mentality of social justice means it comes from upper management. White fragility can be a real barrier to this work. Yes, 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 and yes. Thank you so much, and you can add more. So, you know, we have faced a lot of these things, and Jen's going to talk about sort of common types of resistance and what we can do.
Yeah, so those are all great answers, by the way. And as Pat mentioned, how to deal with resistance is a very important piece of doing anti-racist work. And a first part of the process of dealing with resistance is understanding why and how people are resistant. And you guys have listed a lot of the reasons. Most people, especially people who devote their careers or time to something like suicide prevention, come from a place of really good intentions. We're all here because we want to make a difference. We're all here because we want to save lives. And being asked to examine ourselves and our organization through a lens of social justice and racial equity for some people can feel like a dismissal or discounting of these good intentions. But it's really important for us to understand that impact and intention both matter. Impact matters more when it comes to the harm being done. But intention matters more only as it relates to our willingness to change in response to any harm we unknowingly cause. Intention is important, but it isn't enough. It's only a first step, and that can be really difficult for a lot of people to hear. So as all of your answers have illustrated, it's really complicated to understand all of the reasons why people are resistant. But a few common reasons why tend to be lack of awareness. So a lot of that resistance comes from not seeing racism that people of color encounter on a daily basis and not understanding how prevalent or damaging it is. And partly this is because a lot of white people don't have an accurate understanding of what racism looks like, which is the next form, misunderstanding of what racism actually is. As white people, we have been taught that hatred, overt acts of aggression, and significantly intent are all prerequisites for how we view a racist person or racist acts. We think of overt rather than aversive racism. We think of hate groups, racial slurs, and violence, but we don't often think about what it's like for a person of color when a white person crosses the street to avoid them, or when someone asks, where are you really from? And the reality is that we're all a part of this society, and because of that, we all have problematic and often unacknowledged and unpacked beliefs and attitudes that we have to unconsciously work to undo. And while it isn't much discussed, this is also racism. And acknowledging that impact matters more than intent can be frightening because it leads us to question the pain we have unknowingly caused others in the past. And since we're all coming from a good place and we don't want to harm people, these kinds of thoughts require that we undergo a lot of transformation in order to not only stop causing harm, but to move towards equity. Another reason is white guilt or disavowal of white privilege. So resistance can also come from a reluctance to acknowledge the advantages that we as white people have been given that enable our hard work to result in the outcomes that we expect, or in outcomes that are proportional to the effort we put in, versus the same amount of hard work for people of color not resulting in the same or similar outcomes. Also, acknowledging our privilege requires us to consider that our unwitting complicity in the racist structures that have been oppressing people of color for centuries. And this is a really painful and difficult concept to accept. And finally, aversion to change. Change, once we realize we have to make it, is almost always uncomfortable. But it's especially unsettling when the status quo is made invisible as just the way things are or the optimal way to do things. It's especially uncomfortable when we're asked to change something that we never even questioned in the first place. And this kind of questioning and change makes us examine how we think, how we act, how we work, and how our own organization and structures function to uphold the dominant narrative in a way that is exclusionary and problematic. And understanding all this compels us to action, which is not only uncomfortable, but it's a process that's frustratingly slow, and it's laden with uncertainty, mistakes, and missteps. And we all like to be good at what we do and how we go about solving problems. So that's why people are resistant. But that doesn't usually manifest in how. So how people manifest their resistance. First is relevance, and I believe that was mentioned. So that manifests as, sure, race and social justice are important, but why are they important in suicide prevention when we know more white men die by suicide than any other demographic? But the truth is, people of color still die by suicide in significant numbers. And as a field, we all agree that any suicide is a tragedy. We also don't compare the number of elderly people who die versus young people who die by suicide. But we still recognize that there are specific contextual considerations that need to be addressed in our approaches in order to reach those populations. And we make resources available to address those things. Also mentioned in the chat, time. We don't have time for this. And that manifests as, sure, these are important issues. They might even be relevant to our work, but we already have so much on our plates. Where are we going to find the time to undertake this work? Is it really worth our attention if it means taking time for other things? But taking time to do this work will make all of our efforts stronger. The more time we put into, the more racial equity and social justice become fully integrated. So it's really a lens through which we see all of our work, meaning that considering how racial justice impacts, for example, advocacy or our statewide strategic plan is just an expected part of the conversation around that agenda item. We've found that by focusing on an agenda item related to social justice and racial equity at every meeting, which for us, for EC and general membership translates to 20 minutes every other month, it's resulted in a shift in how the group thinks about and brings up issues of race and social justice without prompting. As a side note, we did this after 2 retreats focused on social justice and racial equity, totaling a day and a half, including a retreat where we came to an understanding of how we would move forward. And one of those things was adding social justice to each agenda item. So each agenda. So there is upfront work and consensus required for that as well. Another manifestation is discomfort, deflection, or denial. So that all the focus on race negates my own or other people's experiences within marginalized groups. So what about women, gay men, poor people, religious minorities? They've also had to contend with oppressive social structures. Why aren't we talking about those experiences? But anti-racist work is social justice. It's all interconnected. And by learning how to examine the status quo and how to question why and how we do things, that opens up the conversation for dismantling all forms of oppression, not just racism. And finally, we have repetition, also known as, we've already done this. And that manifests as this work isn't really necessary because I took a seminar, I performed compliance for grants within my organization, or I discussed this at another job that I've had in the past. But this work isn't one and done. And as long as racism still exists, this work is never going to be finished because hegemonic and white norms still unjustly influence all of our organizational cultures and modes of operation. And people of color are still being denied access, opportunity, and systemic power to influence structure and decision-making. And while some of us might have taken steps to mitigate this, the reality is that as long as racism creates inequity, this work is essential and ongoing for all of us. Also, whether we've done the work at another organization or another context doesn't make it any less necessary within our current organization. Because we're a coalition, for example, some of our members had already done some of this work, particularly to comply with grant requirements. But we hadn't examined our organization, our coalition. And as such, we couldn't make any progress toward becoming more equitable unless we were willing to specifically examine the structures, policies, and practices of our coalition. And this can be actually an opportunity to draw on all of our separate experience and expertise to enhance our collective efforts. So if you get this kind of pushback, you can actually take that as an opportunity to encourage people to step up, to take a more active or leadership role in implementing these processes. But it's really important to remember that because each organization is different, the manifestation of white privilege and white supremacy is going to be embedded differently in the structures, practices, and norms of different organizations, groups, or coalitions. And because of that, the strategies for dismantling these embedded structures will necessarily have to be different. And so even if some of us have done the work before, even if all of us have done the work before, it still becomes necessary for all of us to do this work again together in our own organization.
So, so there's a lot of different types of resistance, and Jen talked a little bit about how to counter some of the resistance. But I'd like to talk further about countering resistance. And how do we counter resistance? And what are some strategies for getting buy-in despite people's reluctance to do the work to make necessary changes? First, we must meet people where they're at and take time to set expectations. Like any education, I'm an educator, people need some kind of scaffolding from the onset to make a sense of where they're going, what they need to do, and what their role will be as part of this process. Now, you need to explain that it's time consuming, and it's also a privilege to not have time for this. People of color live this life and don't have the option to say, I don't have time for racism today. When confronting any time of resistance, it's crucial to try to figure out what might be underneath it. While this can be hard to do in real time, it is worth the effort because it means addressing the actual point of resistance at a much cheaper level. Sometimes when people say we don't have time for this, it really means I'm overwhelmed and I don't think I have time for this. And sometimes it's about white guilt and a sort of a deflecting kind of thing. I don't have time for this because I feel badly. And without making assumptions, we can ask questions that can help clarify for the whole group, not only what the resistance is, but how it can be mitigated. So when the resistance is about time, some of the most important questions you can ask during the process are about what would allow people to have the bandwidth. In our own coalition, we had an incident where people felt that we didn't have enough time at an executive committee meeting to address an issue in a comprehensive enough way. But people were willing to do a retreat, which actually gave us more time than we were asking for initially. And by exploring the issue, we realized that there were two concerns. One was not having enough time at the meeting, and the other was not having enough time to do the activity well and in a meaningful way. So if the resistance is about relevance, point out that people are dying in communities of color, and we have a responsibility to be responsive to all people. And right now, we are not being responsive to communities of color, and we're not addressing the needs of those communities specifically. And those needs may look very different than what we're doing in white communities. Remind people that oppressions are interconnected, and examining systemic racism will create a process to address other inequities. Now, if the resistance is about discomfort, it's important to note that being uncomfortable is okay, and it's actually part of the process, and it's not the same as being unsafe. What's important is what you do with that discomfort. Do you look the other way, or do you sit with it and try to understand why you're uncomfortable? Discomfort is part of moving forward because it means you're addressing things you haven't talked about before, and it's an important part of the process. Our job is to understand why we are uncomfortable and go from there. In fact, the Alliance led with race intentionally with this toolkit because it's something that is uncomfortable. And it's often brushed under the rug because our culture has not come to any sense of equity around racism and racial justice. Now, if the resistance is, we've done this before, it's important to remember that this work is not one size fits all. Rather, we must look at our unique context in order to create an appropriate plan to address equity in our particular organization with its particular needs. You start with identifying gaps and areas of concern, and then begin to implement changes that people are willing to implement right away and that are feasible for your organization where it is now, and that move your organization and members toward further change. So sometimes having an action plan or a framework for doing this work is helpful, and often creates a great way to make sure you're on the same page with respect to what steps you feel ready to take. And we'll talk a little bit more about this later. The process of identifying and questioning these broader and almost always previously unquestioned norms is critical when looking at equity, as it helps us remove our blind spots. It helps us understand that there's no such thing as neutral. I like to say that again. There's no such thing as neutral. This is a step in the process that can't be ignored, but is often met with significant amount of resistance because people are used to doing things the way they've been and will often want tangible proof to why it's important to do things differently. The most difficult aspect of resistance is you don't know when it's going to come up. You can kind of be ready, but you can't really. Because of this, it's important that you set your own expectations in that you're not going to be able to deal with everything perfectly. Now, it gets easier as more people in the organization have experience and knowledge with these issues. The more people who are committed to this work as allies, the more people of color you have, the more voices you have to counter resistance. And hearing from someone other than the 2 or 3 leaders in the effort can be actually more beneficial and transformative. And we've seen this in our own meetings where someone else will speak up and it's not Jen or myself, and it's actually really important. In this work, authenticity is critical. It's important to acknowledge your own privilege. Now, if you're white, it's important to acknowledge white privilege. And if you're a person of color, who, with other social identities, it's important to acknowledge the areas you do have privilege. For me, it's important for me to acknowledge and work on my middle class privilege. It's also important to own your process and your own imperfections, because this gives people permission to make their own mistakes. So be prepared. Although you can't be prepared for every eventuality, you can be prepared in terms of knowing that resistance is going to come up, and trust that you're going to be able to counter it. So you need to make sure you understand what the real resistance is by asking questions to make sure you know what the person is saying. And this also gives you more information on how to formulate a response. When resistance comes up from white people, there can be a question of who should speak up, particularly if you're on a team with people of color and white people together. This is a conversation that has to happen between leadership and should ideally happen in advance of the discussion in order to make sure everyone's on the same page. And sometimes, unfortunately, a response from a white ally might be initially more impactful and difficult to dismiss by a white person who has resistance. It's important for people of color to know they have white allies who can and will speak to resistance. And it's important for allies to acknowledge that they should not speak over people of color during these conversations. So when resistance comes up, there's really sort of 3 ways you can deal with it. There might be more, but we came up with 3. First is to confront the resistance in real time. Remember, you can take a minute to step back, acknowledge resistance, and then counter it. It's okay to recalibrate, take a break, whatever you need to do, and regroup before you counter the resistance. Another option is to finish the activity you started and then come back to the resistance later. It's a valid response to say something like, I hear that such and such is a problem for you, and we've agreed to finish this activity, so we're going to move forward, and I'm happy to talk with you afterwards, or we can come back to this issue after we finish what we're doing. So it's important to think about, like, do you continue with what you're doing, or do you stop and deal with the resistance right away? And then if the resistance is substantial, and perhaps in the whole group, it's important to say, and valid to say, we're going to stop action and come back to it next meeting. Because sometimes it gives people more time to understand what that resistance is about and how to counter it. And it stops people from escalating, because sometimes when you get a lot of resistance, it's like a crowd mentality, and it just kind of goes on, and that doesn't help anybody. Perhaps the most important thing is don't give up. Persistence over resistance. And sometimes this resistance can be derailing, and you do have to continue the work. But it's also important to address why the resistance came up. In that way, resistance is instructive. Resistance, like any kind of learning, is recursive. So be prepared for different types of resistance as you move along the process, and be prepared to be able to counter it. So these are some thoughts on resistance. And now we're going to go back. I just want to remind you of the framework Jen presented earlier. We're going to look at some concretes and some ideas about how to use the toolkit. So first, I just want to remind us that of the framework of how to do this work. So commitment, it means making a commitment to the work, and the work is a process. Education and action are both required, and that's a dialectic, right? You learn something and then you act, and then you learn some more and you act. It's not just you learn a whole bunch and you're done and then you act. It's a back and forth. And understanding and exploring foundational concepts is part of the work. Sometimes people want to change the organization and turn it on its head right away without even understanding the foundational concepts. And being uncomfortable is part of the work. And again, it's not a checklist of actions or behaviors. It is a process, and it's ongoing. And you need ongoing accountability. Like, where are you headed to, and how do you know you got there? And one size does not fit all. You need to be flexible. So with that framework, we're going to think about, well, how do you start the process? Well, we have a toolkit, and we're glad for our own self we have the toolkit, because we are always coming back to it ourselves. So first, you might want to preview the toolkit and see what's in it. And there's a few types of materials that are things like the foundational knowledge materials. We have handouts on white privilege and white allyship, and a lot of the things we've talked about today. There's also inventories, so a series of questions to ask yourself as well as your organization. There are exercises, case studies, a resource list, and a glossary of terms. Now, this is by no means exhaustive. There's huge amounts of information on the internet and amongst probably peers and all sorts of places. So think of it as a starting place. Now, the toolkit is not necessarily intended to be used sequentially. It depends on where your organization is in terms of racial equity and social justice, as well as what conversations need to happen first, right? Sometimes something has come up and it's a teachable moment. Then start there. Many times, though, it is useful to start with foundational knowledge and the knowledge inventory or another inventory to assess what kind of foundational knowledge you have as individuals and as an organization. Now, often organizations feel like they're further along the racial equity and social justice spectrum than they are. We certainly found that it was true for us. We had to really evaluate our organization structures, processes, and communication to get a clear idea of what we needed to focus on. And we realized in that process that we had a lot more work to do than we had originally thought we did. And it's also important that this process is not linear. It's not like you go along and then you're done. You will not be done with one section completely. The process is recursive, where you'll come back to a concept, an exercise, an inventory repeatedly, and learn and discover new things every time. So we developed this toolkit because we saw a need in our organization to make it more racially equitable and socially just. And again, it's important that the work is done on all levels of your organization. It can't just be done siloed in a committee. It can't, I mean, in some ways, it can't just be done by leadership without having information, be on the ground too. So you need to think about how this gets integrated. And I think integrated is a really good word, into all the levels of your organization, into all the work you do. It's a lens through which to look at your work. It's not like a workbook that you're trying to just complete. So some things to consider. First is, where is your organization starting from? Assessment. What are your organization's goals in terms of equity and social justice? And this is an important conversation. I mean, does your organization really want to become an anti-racist organization? Or do they just want to have, more influence in communities of color? Do they want to change the structures of things? Like, what are the goals? And what does that mean? And what pieces of the toolkit will help your organization move forward? Starting with whatever conversations are most necessary at the moment. And we have suggested places to start, but looking at the whole piece, you may need to start somewhere differently, and that's fine. And how do you plan for accountability? There is a handout in there called the equity follow-up chart that asks you to sort of make a plan. You can use that plan, or you can make another plan. I mean, it doesn't really matter, but you need to have a plan, and you need to have a way to chart. Well, did we reach that goal? Did we miss it? What happened, right? And you need to have ways to check in, accountability, ongoing. It's not just like, oh, we're going to set a 2-year plan and at 2 years we look at it. No, you need to look at it 1 month, 3 months, whatever, right? So we need to make sure that you have the accountability. So that's a way to start. And we're going to move to this.
All right, so my call to action for everyone joining us today is to learn how to be okay with being uncomfortable and with making mistakes, to be willing to change to move towards equity, even especially when it's uncomfortable. Because the reality is that if you're doing this work, no matter how careful you are, no matter how much time you spend educating yourself, this work will still be uncomfortable at times. There will be times you'll make mistakes, and some of the changes required are going to be really difficult. And as an ally, making mistakes can be really painful, and change can be daunting, sometimes to the point where it feels paralyzing. But we can't let that paralysis stop the conversation or the work. And this fear of being inadvertently racist or upending the status quo is actually partly how the system perpetuates itself, right? By bringing any constructive dialogue to a grinding halt. And it's crucial we find a way to sit with our own discomfort and move past it, because it's really an essential part of the process of undoing socially unjust systems. For me, it's helped to try to shift my focus. Rather than asking myself, am I going to make a mistake? I ask myself, how am I going to react to and correct the mistakes I make when I make them? Where can my mistakes be instructive and show me my own blind spots or the work I still have to do? And how can sharing my mistakes and imperfections and insecurities make this work easier for someone else? Similarly, as organizations, we're going to make mistakes. We're going to be too slow in changing. But what matters is that we keep working. We keep being committed to this work, even though we aren't doing the work perfectly. What matters is that we keep questioning, that we hold ourselves accountable, that we're willing to change, and we're willing to make changes at all levels of the organization, even if there are missteps along the way. The most important thing is to make sure that we don't limit ourselves to talking and theorizing, but that we commit to personal and organizational action and true transformation, that we work together as allies, excuse me, and as allies, we follow the lead and expectations of the people of color we work with to enact real, albeit slow, steps towards equity within our organizations and ultimately within our field.
So my call to action is to remember that although this process can be slow and frustrating, it is important to persist and be patient. Progress can be made even if it's almost imperceptible. It's like the growth under the snow in February that results in blooming in March when spring comes. This progress can accumulate to result in leaps forward later. And if we're committed to saving lives, which if you're in suicide prevention, I believe we all are, we can't avoid this conversation any longer. We must take action to become more just and equitable. Everything we talked about today is doing the work. And this means that gaining foundational knowledge is doing the work, that understanding and countering resistance is doing the work, that learning how to be an ally is doing the work, that self-care for everyone, but especially for people of color, is also doing the work. Examining organizational norms is doing the work, and using inventories and information in the toolkit is doing the work. It is never static, and it never ends. It is recursive and needs constant accountability, reassessment, and redirection to continue to move forward. So that's the end of our formal presentation. We wanted to leave ample time for questions, because I feel like sometimes in that dialogue, a lot of learning does happen. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat.
We have a question, actually.
You do?
Somebody types,
okay.
Kayleen types, oh no, I'm sorry, Samantha types, our leadership team is entirely white. We've talked about hiring a consultant who's a person of color to lead the charge. Is this essential? We feel stuck if the conversation is only white voices. And that's actually something that has been a challenge for us as well at the coalition. We have a mostly white executive committee, Pata being the exception. And we did feel it was very important that when we brought someone on board to facilitate the conversation during our retreats, that we did hire a person of color. That was important to us in our process. One of the things that we've really been working on is making sure our organization is more welcoming, equitable, and that we can show that we're doing the work, so that when people of color come to our organization, they feel included, they feel like their voices will be heard. And I think, you know, hiring a consultant is a great first step for some organizations. Pada, what do you think?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I just want to say that when I first joined the executive committee, it did not feel as welcoming as it does now for me. Now that a lot of work has been done, I would be more reluctant to bring up an issue, or I would try to figure out, is it all right to do this? So I think that it's very important that even if you are a mostly white or an all white organization, that you figure out how to unpack what it means to be an ally and how to have your organization act in ways that show people of color that we're doing the work. And because what happens a lot of times is that people invite people of color to the table, but they don't realize how hostile the environment is actually for that person of color. And so it's very hard, and then they lose people of color and they wonder why. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really important to think about those issues as well. Okay, let's see. Okay. Let's see, in regard to self-care, what are some tips you can give when individuals are doing this work or beginning to get involved, become triggered? This is a good question. A lot of times I am vocal and I feel like I do a disservice because I go through periods of silence. Yeah. Jen, do you want to?
Sure. So that's an excellent question. I think for me, it's been a process of continually speaking up and using that resistance and that pushback to know what people are ready to address, and taking on the issues that people are ready to look at as a first step then often leads to people being willing to confront more complicated, nuanced, and difficult issues later on. So I would encourage you to keep speaking up. I think if you feel like you're getting a lot of pushback, again, as Pat has said, try to understand why. It would also encourage you to find somebody else in your organization with the same values who can also speak up with you, because it's really hard to be the only person speaking up. But I think continually speaking up, even when you're getting pushback, I believe it does make a difference.
Yeah, and I think in regards to self-care, like Jen says, it's important to speak up, and I don't know whether, I don't know. I think it's important to speak up, but it's also important to take care of yourself. And that's a balance sometimes. I think for people of color and for white people, but particularly for people of color, I think it can be very difficult because, if you're the only one or one of few and you feel like you have to address the issue because no one else is doing it. And there's this burden of needing to speak up. But if that speaking up renders you triggered and a mess, sometimes it makes sense to try to pull back and figure out what you can do to make a change that's not going to put you out there in such a way that is dramatic. So, for instance, if it was at a meeting and you felt like you needed to speak up, you might want to talk to the person privately. That would be something that might be less triggering, perhaps, than to speaking up in front of everybody. You might talk to an ally or someone you think is, like Jen said, has a like-minded thing, and try to formulate a response together. And so I think we need to think about ways to do this that don't sacrifice ourselves. Yeah. Oh, I'm trying to. Yes. Yes. So when someone asks, do you have sessions where you get people to listen and hear people call in a safe environment? Actually, that's interesting you asked that question because at our Department of Public Health uh, conference presentation, we had a whole section where just the people of color spoke. And I think that's really an important thing to do, is to create places for people of color to speak and have white people just listen, and not try to intervene. Jen, do you want to talk about why that was important to you? Because I think you articulated that well.
Sure. So I think it was really important to me because I can't remember a time when I've been given the opportunity to listen to people of color speak and only listen to people of color speak. And as an ally, I realized that is an incredible gift because it takes a lot of emotional labor to do that. And it was a privilege to listen to that panel and that conversation, and I was just very grateful.
All right, let's see. How would I bring this up with conversations with family members who are very ignorant to a lot of this and without it becoming into an argument? This thing moves. I'm sorry, I'm trying to read this. And I have a lot of people in my family who are in such an outrage over our Black Lives Matter movement and saying all lives matter, which gets me enraged and emotional. And it's hard for me not to approach the subject without it becoming an argument. They refuse to research. I've done so much research, and I'm still educating myself. Sorry, this is all over the place. It's not all over the place. It's fine. Yeah. So that's a really good question. It's interesting because I've been having this exact conversation in a number of places. I run a listening circle for Asian American people on Friday afternoon. We have one more, but we've been talking a lot about Black Lives Matter and how Asian American community intersects with Black Lives Matter and issues of family. And the young people are having a hard time talking to their elders about this issue in the Asian American community. And I think it's really challenging when people in your family hold views that are very different than yours.
I love Melita's response. The best reply is that all lives will matter when Black lives matter.
Yes.
I also think that there's a difference between people who are receptive and people who are not yet receptive and may never be. And I think that for me personally, I try to focus my energy on the people who are receptive versus the people who I know will never listen.
And I also feel like, I mean, as an educator, you have to start where people are at. And sometimes that means stepping back and having a conversation about an equity issue that they might understand.
Mm-hmm.
If you're talking to a woman, it might make sense to talk about gender. And I'm not saying that you should ignore the racism. Obviously, I'm not saying that. Nor should we ignore Black Lives Matter in that movement now. But you want people to learn. And if they shut down, they don't learn. So I think, and sometimes an argument is good and gets people to think, but it also depends on how a family fights, if you will. What happens when you do these kinds of conversations, have these kinds of conversations, and it is a very delicate thing. But I think as you learn more, you will be able to be more informed and more prepared to actually talk about these issues and perhaps find a hook, a way in. Okay, let's see. So we have a PSA, yes, Jen, that we made. Let me, and we want to show you this PSA also. First, I want to show you this, which we have a website here. I also put an email. I also put my email in the chat. So either one of those works. And then the toolkit that Kelly put in the chat as well. But we have a PSA that we'd like to show. And let me see if I have to get it. That means you get to see my horrible computer, but let's see if I can get out of here. I'm gonna stop sharing for a minute because I have to get to the, it's not ending. All right. Okay. Hold on.
Mental health is
No, stop. All right, I'm gonna share my screen again. It's one of those things we're trying to find the file on the screen. Oh no, not that. All right. Sorry, everybody. Give me 1 second. Okay. And is this being shared or no? No, huh?
Do you want me to try to share it from mine?
No, I got it. It's
Okay,
just, it's a matter of, it is just a matter of getting the right thing in the right place at the right time. All right, here we go.
in the African American community. Mental health is something that's just starting to be discussed, just starting to be talked about.
I think the stigma about mental health in communities of color come from the fact that there is a distrust between the community and doctors.
Over time, it's been really hard for me to come to terms with my issues with mental health. I've been scared to talk about it, scared to reach out for help, but also just as a man, it's really difficult, I think, for men to always come to terms with how they're feeling.
I think that when it comes to suicide prevention and mental health in communities of color, people are not doing enough.
I think as an Asian American woman, it's been a journey where I've had to navigate my culture in addition to the mental health system itself. I feel like that Asian cultures tend to be rather quiet about these issues, and that is actually a problem for people who are suffering.
Shaming and blaming has a big part to do with why people in the Korean communities do not share. Feeling like you have to hide how, if you have suicidal ideation, that you can't share with any of the adults, that you have to just kind of tough it out and figure out your own problems. I think that as a child, I struggled to have those resources for myself.
No hablamos de salud mental, pero sí hablamos de los montón de locos que tenemos en las familias, eso sí. Y cuando se muere uno por suicidio o están pasando por depresiones, no hacemos nada al respecto. Y una de las cosas que se dice mucho es que están buscando atención. Están buscando atención. Esa persona está buscando atención. Sí, dele atención. Tienes toda la verdad y no es nada negativo.
It's more about understanding what mental health really is, what self-care really is, what those symptoms and feelings and emotions look like. In a lot of ways, the resources that are allocated are always going to be allocated to the communities that are more affluent. And I think that the more the stigma is removed, the easier it'll be to start to implement those resources in different communities.
To reach communities of color and to reach to reach everybody. We need to have an equitable perspective towards suicide prevention.
In order to truly address social justice in our communities and our schools, you have to be willing to consider that for some people, it's not about how hard they work. It's not about how good a person they are, that the system itself makes life a lot easier for certain groups of people than for others.
I believe that social justice work is suicide prevention. We have a role to play. We have a responsibility as white allies to work to undo the structural racism and the damage that's been caused.
Entender lo que el inmigrante o el latino aprecia de su cultura y usar eso como apoyo, verlo como algo que da fuerza, verlo como algo positivo. Hay que estar ahí para darles apoyo, para sacarlos a ver cosas si están aislados. Para sugerir, no quieres hablar con alguien más si no me quieres hablar a mí, pero de no dejarlos solos. El apoyo puede salvar la vida.
When someone really understands that they are of worth, they find ways to have something beautiful to live for. I truly believe that if we all could reach out to someone who is struggling, it would really make a difference.
Suicide doesn't discriminate, and our approaches to suicide prevention shouldn't discriminate either.
Break the silence around suicide.
Everyone is impacted.
Let's break the silence.
Have the conversation.
Rompamos el silencio acerca del suicidio.
Okay. So that's a effort by MCSP, and we're going to be pushing that out soon with a few changes. Jen, did you want to?
So the question is on the website. It's not on the website yet, but it will be. It will be on our social media, and we will keep everyone posted on that.
Okay, and I don't know, were there any other questions that came up during the?
I didn't see any.
Okay,
Laura or Greg, did you see any questions?
all right.
All right. Well, thank you all.
Yeah.
Again,
thanks
thank you, Potter and Jen, for kicking us off on this important series. And thank you everyone for joining us today for the DPH Suicide Prevention Program's first segment on our online racial equity series. We hope you found it to be useful and informative. We also hope that you join us for future sessions that will occur on Wednesdays from 3 to 4:30. Please also visit the DPH Suicide Prevention Program's training website for future segments on the Racial Equity Series signups, in addition to other online trainings pertaining to suicide prevention. And again, you have the web address for the toolkit that can be found on the Coalition for Suicide Prevention website. Thank you again for joining us today. Have a good day.
Thank you, everyone.